Today we're going to take a look at chapters 3 through 5 of Reinventing Project-Based Learning. So in chapter 3, I want you to imagine the possibilities of your project. So you want to think about what is most important. So what are some complex concepts or procedures of your subject that if you studied with your students, you felt they absolutely had to leave the study session with? These are things that you would think if your students didn't learn these, your lesson would be considered a failure. So you want to cut to the heart or cut to the chase. Now, with a published curriculum versus project curriculum, the published curriculum, that would be like your textbook. Those can be a little hard to use. They're predictable, generic. Everything's broken down into little digestible bits, and everything has been judged for you. You don't get to make those decisions of what's most important for your students. So with a project, that's created by you or by your students, and you format it to meet your curriculum. And you can even format it to meet individual student goals, seeing as how you know your students best. Now, this is where your textbook or your published curriculum becomes more of a reference guide. Now, chapter 3 also speaks about digital age skills. So I thought that the most effective one was the Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. So these are steps that every student should know. And project-based learning focuses more on the top 3 tiers of this rainbow cake. So most teachers take for granted that students are going to remember, understand, and apply, but project-based learning makes the students analyze the information that they know, break it down into smaller parts, and then evaluate what those smaller parts are and which ones are of most value, and then use those smaller parts to look at a problem and find a new solution. Chapter 3 also speaks about essential learning functions like research, looking at original works of art or data and coming to their own conclusions, and then taking those ideas, talking about them, figuring out their own meanings, and collaborating with classmates, making sure that they're learning together. Now, with project management, that's where it helps the students bring coherence to their project with tools. So it's making them look at the project and figure out what's going to best suit their needs. And we want students to reflect. We want them to realize that they're actually learning and how they're learning and why they learned more this time than maybe the last time. And with the supported study, that's where they use those textbooks and the published curriculum and use those to help with their learning path. Now, in chapter 4, we look at strategies for discovery. So in this, it's very helpful to figure out if you want to use a project that someone else has designed or if you want to design your own project. And if you do design your own project, how can you make sure it's effective? So using a published project can be a little tricky. You want to make sure that it's going to meet your needs. So when you're looking at a project, there are some downfalls or pitfalls that you want to make sure that you avoid. And some of those would be a long time commitment with low educational outcome, too many steps. You want to make sure that your steps are limited and lead to predictable results. Maybe your project doesn't really leave enough room for assessment to make sure that your students are getting to those results. And maybe your project isn't integrating technology as well as it could. Now, with those pitfalls in mind, there are different ways to make sure that you can adapt the project to best fit your needs, like making sure that the projects compare and contrast, or having your students predict what can happen, or maybe having them look at the parts to figure out how it relates to the whole, or looking at systems. So the text in chapter 4 focuses on different ways that you can maybe make a project or take a project and make it even better. Now, there are some very important features. I'm going to focus on just a couple of those that I have listed on the screen. Probably one of the most important is the generative. Generative means that your students are constructing meaning. They're looking at the parts, they're analyzing it, they're coming up with their own definitions and what's important. We also want them to use those digital age skills, especially looking forward to the future. We want to make sure that they're communicating, that they're using project management, and that they're really using technology to their full focus. And of course, learning by doing. We want our students to get really hands-on. Most of us learn by doing. Now, in Chapter 5, we look at making assessments and making sure that it's useful and meaningful. So a quote from our text that I thought was really useful was, when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative. When the guest tastes the soup, that's summative. It gives us a basic idea of the two different types of assessment. But let's go ahead and look a little bit deeper and look at summative. So summative is a final assessment, like the sum of the parts. So we are used to seeing that in college as a rubric where we are looking at knowledge, skills, and processes. So I have a rubric from the text where it talks about, I believe this was a story, where the teacher is looking for these 5 different categories across the top. They're looking at design, knowledge, application, presentation, and process. Now, on the left-hand side, that's where the teacher lists whether it's exceeds expectations all the way down to does not meet expectations. And that lets the students, the teachers, and the parents know exactly why a project was graded the way that it was, or if a student wants to get that higher grade, what they need to do. Now, a formative assessment is something that happens as you go. It creates a form for the project, like milestones or check-ins. So the milestones break the project down and really sets the pace, whereas check-ins are verbal. They're like meetings where you focus on learning objectives that aren't necessarily part of the project, but are a core concept to how our students actually become learners. And some different assessments are like brainstorms, where you get the class together and you do a concept map up on the board, or checklists, kind of like a rubric, but as you go along, or at a portfolio where they combine their process and turn it in with the project, where you get to see everything as it goes. So I've got my sources up here. Most important is that reference for our Reinventing Project-Based Learning. I do have my image URLs up there, so if you want to use those for yourself, you are more than welcome.